Now I'd like to talk about what our purpose is in this course. If you look at the syllabus, you'll notice that there's quite a few learning objectives. You'll also notice that there's just the basic description of the course, which is surveys Alaska Native peoples, including cultural heritage, ethnohistory, basically just the history of the people, especially as told by themselves, and contemporary experiences from an anthropological perspective. Our approach to that kind of broad topic is going to be divided into 3 units. The first unit, which has I think 4 or 5 modules, is we're going to talk about knowing our place in history, so a lot of things about sort of the history of Alaska Native peoples within Alaska, both from time immemorial over millennia, as well as more recently, as well as talking about Dena'ina traditional culture, kind of knowing about the history. Unit 2 is we're going to be talking about some basics of many diverse cultures and lifeways, and we're going to not cover every Alaska Native local group or village. That would be very hard to do in a class like this. What we will try to do is cover really kind of like all of the major language groups, which tends to map on at least okay-ish with basically different cultural traditions. And so we'll kind of cover each of the major cultural traditions within Alaska that are native to Alaska, that are contemporary. And then in Unit 3, we will cover contemporary topics involving many different indigenous groups, so things like land issues, or things like representation and art and stuff like that. Now, that's kind of my purpose in teaching this class to you and what the university would like you to get out of this class, at least some of it. I want to know, though, what's your purpose in taking this class? Research suggests that students do a lot better in classes if they kind of have their own mission with the class and their own sense that they're sort of guiding their education. So the first assignment you do, it's going to ask you a series of questions, including your familiarity with the topic, but it's also going to ask you to set 3 learning goals for yourself. And something a little bit better than I want to get an A in the class. That's an awesome goal, but that's not what I mean. What I mean is, what are some things you want to get out of this class? I'm a really big believer that classes like this, although they do serve kind of a general education purpose, they're there, as the GER description suggests, to help teach you about societies and help teach you about cultural diversity. But at the same time, I also think classes like this can be and should be and are really relevant to whatever you're going into, whatever educational path you're taking, whatever career you're going into, especially if you're sticking around Alaska. With over 15% of the population being Alaska Native, I think it's really critical that you understand about Alaska Native peoples and cultures. And so maybe chart out for you what are 3 things you want to get out of this class, and they can be related to your career or just to your own, just kind of interests, things you're curious about. When we talk about our purpose in the course, I also kind of think about 3 myths that I want to educate against, that I kind of want to show are wrong. Myth number 1 is the idea, so these are 3, what I mean by 3 myths is, these are ideas people sometimes have about Alaska Native people, and more generally about Indigenous Americans. So myth number 1 is the idea that Alaska Native cultures or peoples are gone or are dying out. Myth number 2 is that Alaska Native is a single culture. So if somebody was to say, oh, Alaska Native culture is amazing, well, that suggests that all Alaska Native people kind of fall under one umbrella culture. And myth number 3 would be the idea that of colonialism in Alaska happened a long time ago. So as far as myth number 1, Alaska Native cultures or peoples are gone or dying, the reality is this is just not the case, factually speaking. There are over 115,000 people that on some of the most recent census data identified as Alaska Native, and that's 15% of the state's population, right? That's a huge percentage of the state's population. And I think most people would recognize that if they've lived in Alaska for a while. They've met Alaska Native people, or maybe you are an Alaska Native person, right? So I think we recognize that there are Alaska Native people in our communities. But I think what maybe people sometimes think is that although there are Alaska Native people in our communities, that maybe the cultural practices and beliefs have sort of died out. And I think what you see instead, especially over the last several decades, is that yes, there was a lot of trauma related to colonialism and to boarding schools and things of this nature, and land dispossession that definitely affected cultures, but at the same time there's a great degree of cultures persisting, people still kind of honoring their traditions, and also people revitalizing their traditions, kind of bringing back things that had lapsed for a while. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted you to do that reading by the Kenaitze Indian tribe, which is an indigenous tribal group here on Kenai Peninsula, where it was talking about the first fish pot latch, to kind of show that these traditions are again, in many cases, not only not dead, but in fact kind of being brought back and revitalized. So that's important. And, I think one reason people sometimes think that Alaska Native cultures or indigenous cultures generally are going away is because they might look different in some ways than they did 300 years ago. But that only makes sense, right? So somebody doesn't have to live in the same kind of house or shelter that their great-great-great-great-grandparents lived in to still be carrying on that culture, any more than sort of European Americans need to be living in covered wagons, right? And old school log cabins to still be carrying on the culture of their great-great-great-grandparents. So the fact that Alaska Native groups, for example, might be doing traditional hunting but doing it with a shotgun and a snowmobile doesn't mean you don't still have those cultural practices going on. And especially when we get into the realm of things like cultural beliefs and language and kind of overall worldview, these are things that have very much, for many groups, persisted to the present day. And part of being sort of an educated citizen of Alaska is understanding how these cultures have persisted to the present day and how they affect other people. And by the way, I'm using the word culture a lot of times, so if you've not taken a social science class before, I'd like to kind of clarify how we're using that term, because sometimes in popular conversation we can mean a lot of different things by that term. What I mean when I'm saying culture is a group of people's shared way of thinking, believing, communicating, and acting. So the fact that people in the United States, for example, often drive cars to work is a simple aspect of culture, right? So culture is all about sort of what we share as a group. And I sometimes think of it as the software of a human group, in the sense that our biology is the hardware, and our biology is fundamentally very similar across the human population. We have slight differences between populations in terms of how we look and everything, but taken genetically speaking, we're very, very, very similar, all of us, to each other. But our software is very different, right? In the sense of whatever our society teaches us about how to think and how to behave, and how to act and what we value in life. And, to varying degrees, we sometimes accept the culture we were raised in, sometimes reject it, and most of us kind of make a peace with it, right? And so that's what I mean by culture. And in that regard, Alaska Native cultures are still very much ongoing and persistent. Myth number 2, the idea that Alaska Native is a single culture. When I was teaching and living in the lower 48, the way you often see this is people will say, well, Native American culture, I love Native American culture, I want to learn about Native American culture. But this suggests that there's sort of one way of life, one way of thinking that's true across all these indigenous people. The reality is, Alaska is very, very diverse. It was before colonialism, it still is. There are dozens of distinct groups, and there would be many, many different distinct local groups prior to and after colonialism. But if we were to kind of lump them into some general categories of, quote, cultures, we would notice, for example, there's 21 distinct languages. And some of those languages, like Dena'ina and Atna, are fairly similarly related, kind of like, French and Spanish and Italian belonging to the same language family. But some of those languages, let's take Inupiat and Dena'ina, are as different as, let's say, Italian and Russian, or Italian and Chinese. And so, huge amount of linguistic diversity, also diversity in terms of belief systems, diversity in terms of value systems, diversity in terms of kinship, sort of how people structured and still structure their families. All these things are very diverse across the different Native groups in our area. There's over 200 recognized tribal entities in Alaska. Specifically, there are 13 regional corporations, and we'll talk about what that means later, and 198 village corporations, as well as groups specifically identified as tribes. So we'll talk about all that later in this semester, but it's diverse. And again, the differences between these groups are not sort of just surface level, right? You might say, well, yeah, sure, but these are all sort of Alaska Native culture. It's all kind of similar. No. Major differences, right? So I've got here a picture of Robert Davidson, who's a well-known Haida artist. So this would be down close to British Columbia, would be where Haida culture is from, dancing in traditional regalia. And then here on the bottom picture, you have two Inuit men that are dragging some muktuk, some whale blubber and skin, near Barrow, Alaska, so totally different ends of the state. And you can imagine that two groups that lived that far apart from each other developed very different ways of life, and you'd be exactly correct. Inuit people prior to colonialism would have been in much smaller groups that are potentially more mobile. Haida groups had more set in one place within their territory kind of types of things, but then you also did have Inuit villages, different types of food that were eaten, different types of religious beliefs and stories and religious practitioners, very different languages. So these are not surface level differences, and when we refer to it all as Alaska Native, well, sometimes we have to, right? Especially a lot in this class, where sometimes we're talking about big topics that affect all the different Alaska Native groups, but when we're talking about that, we should always keep in the back of our mind, and maybe even the front of our mind, that these are really diverse groups that we're kind of calling under one name, right? And that kind of relates to, people will sometimes ask, well, what's the right way to refer to folks that are Indigenous? And I often will use the term Indigenous because I kind of like the way it works. It honors sort of the nativeness of a group. But I would say that in my speaking with Native peoples, what I hear a lot from folks is, if possible, we'd like to be referred to by the specific group we're from, like anybody else, right? Sometimes we do need those bigger terms like Alaska Native, but again, always remember that there's that individual diversity. And of course, even diversity within these cultures. It's not as if, every Dena'ina person agrees on every subject any more than you agree on every subject even within your own family. And so groups are very diverse in terms of how they think about their culture and their practices. Okay, myth number 3 is that colonialism in Alaska happened a long time ago. And the reality of that, of course, is that the colonial past shapes the colonial present, or we might even better say the colonial past shapes the colonial presence. As one Indigenous author said, post-colonial, where did the colonizers go, right? Kind of this idea of, it's not as if just because the historic sort of moving in of European and European American groups into Alaska, just because that historically was something that happened in 1700s and 1800s and 1900s, doesn't mean that in the 2000s we're not still engaged in a space that is colonial, right? It's not as if Native groups have all of their land back or anything, and in many cases very little amount of land possessions of what historically would have been Native lands. So colonialism, although it's shifted in form, it still very much exists. And again, talking about that is not to induce guilt in any people that are not Native that are taking this class, self-included, but it's to make sure that we kind of fully understand. If we think of it just as a past tense thing, we're never going to understand why Native groups have certain kinds of rights but not other kinds of rights, and why they can sometimes be affected by decisions that they don't get much of a say in. Okay, this is a good place to stop.